So thanks for having me. It's been a very inspiring conference. I feel like I've found my tribe. So it's nice to be in a room full of people who feel similarly. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself. I'm the "what are we doing here" guy. And I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't criticizing the work that we're doing. It was more so just an expression of the existential angst I currently occasionally experience doing this kind of work, and also probably a bit of PhD angst mixed into that. And I also thought I'd introduce myself from my frame of reference and how I see things. So I know we have neuroscientists in the room, we have architects. I actually came to where I'm currently doing my PhD in cognitive neuroscience from my experience working as an occupational therapist. Does anyone know what occupational therapy is? They're pretty, okay, awesome, nice. Usually there's much less hands. What I think is interesting about occupational therapy is actually how it came together. So one of the founding myths or the origin story of occupational therapy was that it was actually an architect that brought together a social worker, a teacher, a doctor, an architect, obviously, to figure out someone who could really address the things that they all touched on, but to look at healthcare from that perspective. So occupational therapists are considered to be jack of all trades. So we learn everything from human factors to human anatomy, universal design to neuroscience. And so we have a really kind of broad education. And I think if we're looking for a bridge between neuroscience and architecture, then occupational therapy or occupational science could actually be an interesting way to go about it. But occupational therapists also distinguish themselves from other healthcare professionals in the sense that we really try to examine how someone's environment shapes their health. And so occupation is something that people engage in, from your self-care activities to being architects or professors. And the idea is that basically the better fit that there is between the person, the thing that they're doing, and most importantly, the environment, the healthier that they'll be. So using this framework, I worked in a mental health institution called CAMH in Toronto, a psychiatric facility. I worked with people with schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. So my job was really to take them from settings like this to living in places like this, in chaotic environments like this. And it was in that process where I was like, we're trying to focus on the environment. Occupational therapists talk a lot about how the environment affects our mental health or our well-being, but there hadn't been a whole lot of actual research being done on it. So I quit my job and started my PhD. Beyond my personal interest, why is it important that we examine the psychological impacts of urban design? The world's becoming rapidly urbanized, mental illnesses are increasing, there's a huge economic impact of that, or burden. And we know that obviously there are higher rates of mental illness in cities, but we don't really know why. And I think neuroscience offers a really good toolkit to look at that mechanism a bit more. Obviously, there's probably a million things in a city that would make someone stressed out. For the purposes of a dissertation I'd like to complete within the 4-year period, I had to really focus on one element of cities. And something that I find really interesting is obviously this drive to densify and build upwards. People are heralding skyscrapers as saviors of the city. They'll solve all of the problems, and I think there are some definite benefits to it. But there are also problems associated with skyscrapers. They increase noise exposure at the street level. They increase pollution. There are conversations happening about how living in them causes mental health issues. But what I'm interested in is how living around them might impact our psychology. So there have been a few studies done on how people experience skyscrapers. They found that, Lindell and Hartig found that there's a negative effect on the restoration likelihood, so people there was a negative correlation with that. They cause behavioral freezing or negative awe. And interestingly, the study by Asgharzadeh, they considered tall buildings to be what they said was oppressive. And it was Asgharzadeh's study that I found really interesting and really informed the work that I'm doing. And they talk about this term, a Japanese term called apakukan. I'm sorry if I butchered that, but basically it's a Japanese word that refers to a sense of crowding, the feeling that you get when you're in a crowded subway car, perhaps, in a room with low ceilings. They don't seem to be that oppressed or sad by it, but or this feeling that you get when you're around really tall buildings. So what they did was they showed people pictures at different angles of tall buildings with and without trees, and had these students rate them on oppressiveness from 1 to 7. And lo and behold, they found that tall buildings were oppressive. And they made some suggestions that cause anxiety and stress, but it wasn't actually measured, and that's what I'm kind of more interested in, is trying to measure or understand those impacts. So what I do for my research is I stick people in VR. That's me and the president of the University of Waterloo. He was in that day, and I thought I'd use this picture as a photo op for him. But we basically put people in a Vive, and then we expose them to different environments. And I know the architects and maybe even some of the neuroscientists in the room will cringe when they see these pictures, but I have to stress that, that we're really trying to manipulate one variable, and that's building height. And so these obviously aren't the most beautiful buildings or realistic buildings, but we're really interested in how people responded to building height specifically. So we put them in low and tall building conditions, and then we had trees added as well. So basically what we did is we had participants sit for 2 minutes to get a baseline for the skin conductance levels. They spent 5 minutes in these environments just looking around. There was deception involved. We told them that they were going to have to sketch the environment afterwards, just to ensure that they were paying attention. Undergrad psychology students might zone out, and we just wanted to ensure that there was some sort of effect that they were getting from their environments. And then following exposure, they completed an affect measure and the suppressiveness questionnaire. So to reiterate, we manipulated building height and trees, and then we looked at affect through skin conductance levels, an implicit measure, and an oppressiveness questionnaire, which looked at those specific questions, and it was on a Likert scale of 1 to 7. I'm assuming most people here know what electrodermal activity or galvanic skin response is, but I just thought I'd just really, really quickly give you an overview. Basically, we sweat, obviously, for thermoregulation, but also we sweat emotionally, and it's that emotional sweat that we measure using something called a shimmer. And it's said to be seen as a proxy for someone's emotional state. And these are the different ways you can look at it. There can be the level, which is someone's measurement over time. You can look at specific responses to stimuli or non-specific responses, and these are some different ways that we can analyze the data. So we started by using this implicit affect test. We thought that it would be better to try and access someone's unconscious affect as opposed to explicitly asking them. So we predicted basically in tall building environments that people would have higher skin conductance levels, negative affect would be higher, there would be lower positive affect, and oppressiveness would be higher, and that trees would mitigate all those effects. So we did find that people found high buildings more oppressive. Interestingly, this wasn't part of our hypothesis, but we also asked questions around openness, and people found low building environments more open. This is the skin conductance data. So what we did for that was we took the 5-minute measurement and we broke it into 1-minute epochs and ran repeated measures on that to see how things changed over time. And we found a significant effective condition. So it looked like people were at least more aroused in these tall building environments. Unfortunately, the affect measures that we used didn't really pan out. So both positive affect and negative affect didn't yield any significant results. So I think one of the things that I find challenging about some of this research is I think we still have a pretty poor understanding of emotion or affect or how to even measure that. And so we did another study to follow up to maybe get a bit closer to that. So we used different affect measures. This time we asked explicitly how people felt using the PANAS and the affective slider scale. And we also used the skin conductance level. In addition, we were also interested in the proxemic experience. So Apaku-Khan, which is what Asgharzadeh spoke to in that first paper, is basically about proxemics. It's about this feeling of invasion of space. So we thought that would be an interesting variable to add into this second study that we had to do again because we didn't get those affective responses that we were looking for in the first one. So we got people to basically estimate their egocentric distance, so the distance between them and these objects. So it was either a phone booth or an avatar. Again, we used the Vive, and we used the controllers this time as well because we felt that in the first study that we did, we had people answer these affect measures after exposure, and we thought that maybe some of the effect was lost. So this may not, it obviously wasn't realistic, but it probably got people more, access more of their affect in the actual moment of them being in these environments. So After the 5-minute exposure of them looking around these environments, these scales popped up, and they used their Vive to basically choose and fill out the questionnaires. So this was the PANAS, which is basically a self-report questionnaire, has two 10-item scales that measures both positive and negative affect, and it can access someone's affect in the moment, but also their affect retrospectively, so over the past year. We were more interested in the moment. And this is the affective slider scale, which is basically emojis where people, again, would drag this ball to where they thought was appropriate. The top measures mood, the bottom measures arousal. But like I said, we were also interested in proxemics. Again, if people in these environments feel like they're being impinged upon or intimidated or having their space violated by these tall buildings, can we actually look at that? And there's been some interesting work done on proxemics. So when people are in a stress state, they keep more space between themselves and other people. If they make mutual gaze contact, there's more space as well. So after the 5 minutes were up and they finished those two questionnaires, this guy popped up, or this phone booth popped up, and they were just basically asked to estimate how far away it was. So we predicted that in the tall building environments, similarly to our first experiment, that people would have higher negative affect. And we also felt that perhaps people would estimate the object and the avatar to be closer to them because of that compression effect, and that all participants would perceive the avatar to be closer to them than the phone booth in all conditions. So we didn't get the results that we were looking for, again, on mood and arousal as measured by the affective slider scale. Positive affect, again, we didn't get any significant results as measured by the PANAS. And then negative affect, we got a trending effect, but in the opposite direction, and I wasn't too sure what to make of that. And nothing came out of our, we used this exact same method to look at the skin conductance level data for this, and we didn't get any effects. And then for distance estimation, again, we got a trending effect, and basically what it suggested was that people saw objects and avatars as farther away in the tall building environment, which is the opposite of what we had predicted. So, as you can see, we didn't really get anything that we were hoping to get. But I think it's important. I think in all science, and in psychology, there's a huge issue, and I think in most fields that people don't want to talk about negative results or null effects, which I think is it's not good. And I think that, especially in this area that we're in, we should be actively sharing negative results because we're still trying to understand the method of how to go about these things. So if we didn't get the results, at least we figured out what didn't work, and hopefully that helps other people. So in future directions, we want to do some real-world research. So I did that this summer in London, and I got some really interesting results that I'll share maybe next time. I took some 360 video in those locations in central London, and we're going to use VR to see if we can use 360 video of these locations to test these effects. Maybe putting more avatars in the space, maybe putting moving avatars. So that's a GIF of a video, a screenshot of another experiment that I'm doing looking at proxemic behavior of pedestrians. So maybe we can combine those two. Or maybe we need more oppressive environments where the buildings actually slant that way to get an actual effect. I started with a meme, so I figured I'd finish with a quote. And I feel like this really kind of captures what we're all trying to do here. And I think it's an extremely exciting field to be a part of, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to share some of my work, null effects or not, with you all. So thank you.
Very good. All right. One question. Okay.
So I know there's been a lot of discussion going on about virtual versus real. And I know that it's very hard to take away all of the aspects that you would have in a real scenario. But there's a lot of research that has been done on real cities that you should look at. Colin Elard obviously has done a bunch and there's others here that have. But I think that the negative, or the results that you got, I would be interested to know whether it's because it's not real. We're not getting the echo, we're not getting the blinding sun from the glass. I think it would be interesting to incorporate.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm working with Colin Ellard, I forgot to mention that.
There you go.
Colin and I have talked a lot about this, and that's actually why we did the research we did in London this summer. Was we found actually, it's amazing. We found this in central London, these really, really tall buildings on a cul-de-sac, right across the street from like a really low-level church. So it's like the perfect real-world environment to look at this, and we did find some effects. So yeah, you're right. I think if it's VR is really helpful for isolating variables, but at the same time, I think we lose a lot of that effect that we get from just real life.
What was the age group that you used?
Oh,
were they used to do it?
Sorry?
Or were they used to playing games?
Yeah, that's something else. I mean, they were university students, like first and second year psychology students. So,
Okay.
yeah, and VR is becoming more prevalent,
They
in
might
that
not be as
population.
affected, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.